Oh, oh God. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Gamester here. Today we are looking at Immerseus, the first boss in Siege of Orgrimmar. And this is the full guide. If you just want a quick guide for your raid, you can click on the annotation. And there's also shorter guides for specific roles of tank, heal, or DPS. So let's get started. So for your raid composition, pretty standard stuff. You'll need 2 tanks and 2 or 3 healers. We are using 2 healers here, and the damage on this fight is very forgiving. There's not a lot going on. The only time things can get risky is during the transition periods, which we'll talk about in a moment. Depending on how your raid deals with the slimes, you can get a fair bit of spike damage. But if you use raid cooldowns properly, then 2 healers should be plenty for this. So at the start of the fight, you'll notice that Immerseus has fairly low health, about 60 million. This is because the goal of the fight is to actually reduce his energy or corruption to 0, rather than just defeat his health. So every time you actually get Immerseus down to 1 hit point, he will submerge for a few seconds and spawn a huge number of oozes around the outside of the room. There are 2 different types of oozes, which we'll get into in a moment. But the basic goal here is to defeat as many oozes as you can, because every ooze that you defeat during that phase will reduce Immerseus' corruption level by 1 point. So in total, to win the fight, you have to get his corruption down by 100, or therefore defeat 100 oozes in total. Now once Immerseus reappears after a submerge phase, his total health at the time will be equal to the percent of his corruption level that he was at after the phase. So if you've gotten rid of 50% of his corruption, when he reemerges after his submerge phase at that time, he will only come back with 50% health. So around 30 million at the time. So as the fight progresses, as you defeat more oozes, it'll be easier and easier and faster to actually push him into a submerge phase once again. So it speeds up as the fight progresses. So once Immerseus has submerged, he will spawn 2 different types of puddles or oozes that will shoot to the side of the room. The first type is the Sha Puddle, and these are the darker colored ones. These need to be killed by your DPS players. So you can see we have markers around the room. We kind of spread out our DPS, so there's 1 or 2 DPS per quadrant of the area, so that once the Sha Puddles have spawned, players are not running around over each other trying to get access to the puddles. The idea being we want to kill as many as possible. So here you can see he's submerging, and then you can see the little oozes shooting out, and you can see where they're going to land. So the darker ones, the Sha Puddles, should be attacked by your DPS. You can see a DPS on the right of the screen there, killed one. Once a Sha Puddle is killed, if any player is within 10 yards, they will receive a stacking buff that increases their damage for 15 seconds. So the idea is to burst down the first one right away, make sure you're within melee range or close to it, get that buff, and then you can burst down the next one even faster and faster and so on. So your DPS should be spread and use minor personal cooldowns to make sure that they can burst that first one down, get that buff, and then progress and DPS the rest of them quickly as well. Now, a counter to the Sha Puddles is the Contaminated Puddles. These are much lighter, and these are dealt with by your healers. So you can see there's one there. So the opposite of the Sha Puddles, these need to be healed to full health. And similar, once they're healed to full, anyone within about 10 yards will receive a stacking buff that increases healing by 75% per stack, and as well increases or regens 25% of the player's mana. So essentially your healers can feel free to spam their really expensive spells on this fight, because being within melee range of 1 or 2 Contaminated Puddles will regen a huge amount. But once again, the basic idea is the same. So just like DPS, your healer wants to burst down or burst up, rather, the health of that first Contaminated Puddle that they get. So here you can see I'm trying to find some that I can heal pretty quickly. And then once that one's full, they'll get the buff if they're within melee range, and they can heal some others as well. So here I tried spinning crane kick. It didn't actually work, which I learned later on. But anyway, we'll get into tips of that nature if you want to look at the healer guide itself. Anyway, the basic idea is the same. Heal up as many as you can, and you'll get better and better at that healing the more buffs you get. Okay, so now we know to attack the Sha Puddles and heal the corrupted or contaminated puddles. But what does this get you? I mentioned before that this reduces the corruption for Immerseus by 1 point per puddle that you defeat, which is great, but there's also some damage involved. And the good news is that the better you are at defeating puddles, the less damage you'll take, for the most part. So, anytime one of these puddles that is shot out reaches Immerseus during this phase, the raid will take some damage unless that puddle is purified, unless it's basically defeated. So, essentially, every time one of the Sha Puddles, the ones the DPS are attacking, reaches the boss, you will take Erupting Sha damage, which is about 75,000 damage to the raid. So, if your DPS are somewhat weak or have trouble defeating a lot of the puddles, you will get quite a bit of burst damage at the end of this phase. So you might need raid cooldowns for that purpose. Similarly, but to a lesser extent, any of the contaminated puddles that healers are dealing with that reach the boss before they're purified will do less damage. They'll do Erupting Waters, which is about 30,000 damage to the raid. So a little under half of the DPS version. So for this reason, you can obviously, assume that you'll have more DPS going out than you will healing, just because you have 2 or 3 healers and the rest of your raid can do DPS in some form. So it's a good balance. But that said, if you have to prioritize one or the other, then generally the DPS ones are more important than the healer ones, because the raid will be taking less damage overall if the healer ones land. So a few tips for handling the puddles, because so much of the fight revolves around doing this properly. The first is to watch where the puddle clumps are sort of aiming from the center when the phase begins. So you can see here as Immerseus goes down, I sort of turn my camera to look and see, okay, well the clump, the guys that I'm dealing with, which are the lighter colored ones for healing, is closest to me here. So only 2, maybe 3 are in range of me, but it's better than nothing. So DPS can do something similar. Just watch where those clumps are aimed at, and then you can hopefully pick up the majority of them that are near you. Also, using quadrants will help a lot, as mentioned before. Second is to use movement speed buffs. So obviously personal or raid cooldowns work great, but you just want to make sure you're always in melee range when that first puddle is defeated, so you get that buff right away. Similarly, you want to use personal or high burst cooldowns for that very first puddle, so that the sooner that first puddle is defeated and you get that stacking buff started, the easier subsequent puddles will be. And then finally, for your healers, area of effect heal cooldowns after the first puddle buff are extremely strong. So if you watch here, I get this first buff, and then I use a potion to increase my intellect, and then I use revival, and it hits everything pretty much and heals it all in one spell. So obviously very strong spell. For people complaining about 30% nerf, you're an idiot. But anyway, so yeah, obviously heal spells that have an area of effect, I'm sure Tranquility or others would work just as well. So take advantage of those. Once you get that first buff that increases your healing by 75%, then you can be certain that you're doing as much as you can to the remainder. So another important aspect is, just like many of the fights in Siege, Blizzard is really big on tank swaps in this tier. They don't want any one tank shenanigans. So this fight has Corrosive Blast, which is cast on the current main tank in a cone, and basically it increases damage taken by subsequent Corrosive Blasts by 300%. So you just have to swap between your tanks, pretty standard stuff. When one fades, the next tank picks it up. And If you have to hold it for additional casts, make sure your tank uses a cooldown of some sort. The timer should be pretty accurate on that. The final mechanic to be wary of on this encounter is really Swirl and the Sha Pools. So there you can see a pool just formed underneath my feet. Throughout the fight, well, at least during the normal phase, Immerseus will cast bolts on random players, and after the bolt hits, it'll do some damage and then form a little pool underneath the player. These pools will be sucked up by Immerseus when he submerges, so you only need to be wary of them during the normal base phase. That will go away after that. So here you can see submerging, and there go the pools being sucked up. So for the most part, the room will be cleared out every time he resets that. However, the other ability to watch for is Swirl, which he seems to cast pretty much once per normal phase, although it depends how long the phase lasts. Once he's lower health, he may not have an opportunity to do that before you get him down to 1 hit point once again. But for the most part, Swirl is just as it sounds. He will start to cast a breath attack in front of him, a cone attack, and he will turn slowly, so players will want to sidestep to make sure they avoid getting hit by the front when he does that. And that's all there is to it, really. So both those things are very basic. Just avoid the puddles as they keep spawning near you, and then they'll be cleared out. And while he's swirling, as you see here, there will be some ground effects that will form that will try to knock you in the air and make it a little more difficult to get out of the front of his cone there. So with that, I think that covers everything for Immerseus normal difficulty. He is a pretty simple boss, but appropriate for the first encounter of the zone, I believe, and kind of fun. So the real key is just to focus on handling the puddles properly. Make sure you get your raid split up in their appropriate quadrants so that everyone can, handle the spawns that are near them as needed. Make sure your healers are split across the sides so that you have healing on every angle that is necessary, and just burst down those initial puddles so you can get the subsequent ones that much faster. Other than that, just dodge the ground effects and the swirl during the normal phase, keep your tanks up, and eventually you will whittle him down. So, good luck, and thanks for watching.